The analysts now say that this war in Ukraine for Russia is looking more and more like it could be a stalemate. According to the Washington Post, Russia's attempt to conquer Ukraine could be headed toward a stalemate as heavy casualties and equipment losses take a toll on unprepared Russian forces that have failed so far to achieve any of their initial objectives, Western officials and military experts say. The front lines have barely moved in more than a week. Russians are being killed or injured at a rate of up to 1,000 a day, according to Western intelligence estimates, and even more, according to Ukrainian ones. Russia has basically been stalled out. They've been unable to take any significant city inside of Ukraine, including Mariupol, where the siege continues. They've been unable to surround Kharkiv. They've been unable to surround Kyiv. They've been unable to cut off weapons shipments into Ukraine. And this is a stunning defeat for Vladimir Putin, who is supposed to be the head of this mighty war machine. And it turns out that they cannot even take over and defeat a nation that has 1/10 of their military budget or so. According to the Washington Post, the ferocity of the Russian assault has only intensified as the advances have slowed, with Russia substituting harsh bombardment of civilian populations for progress on the battlefield. Regular Ukrainians living in cities surrounding or partially surrounded by Russian troops are paying the price for a war effort that began to go wrong in the very first hours. But in the absence of substantive progress on the ground, given the scale of the losses being inflicted on its ranks, Russia's military campaign could soon become unsustainable, with troops unable to advance because they lack sufficient manpower, supplies, and munitions, according to analysts and officials. The next 2 weeks, they say, could be critical in determining the outcome of the entire war. Unless Russia can swiftly improve its supply lines, bring reinforcements, and bolster the flagging morale of the troops on the ground, its goals may become impossible to achieve. Rob Lee, former U.S. Marine, who's now senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, he says, "I don't think Ukraine forces can push Russian forces out of Ukraine, but I also don't think Russian forces can take that much more of Ukraine." An assessment Saturday by the Institute for the Study of War went further. They said Ukrainian forces have defeated the initial Russian campaign of this war. The conflict has now reached a stalemate. Now, the Russian strategy when it comes to this sort of stuff is, if things don't go well for us, then we just up the amount of carnage that we inflict on the enemy. And Russia is firing more and more materiel into civilian centers. Russia is getting harsher and harsher on the civilian centers in Ukraine. And they're also beginning to use weapons that are largely directed at reminding the West to stay out of the conflict directly. So over the weekend, Russia said it twice deployed its newest Kinzhal Dagger hypersonic missile in Ukraine, claiming on Sunday to have destroyed a fuel depot near Mykolaiv. And on Saturday, an underground missile and ammunition storage site in the West. The state news agency RIA Novosti has said the attacks represented the first use of the next-generation weapon since the start of the war in Ukraine. Western analysts said that these were the first time hypersonic missiles had ever been used in combat. Vladimir Putin has described that missile as an ideal weapon. It's designed to be launched from a MiG. It can fly at up to 10 times the speed of sound, and like a slower cruise missile, can maneuver in mid-flight, making it harder for air defense systems to track and intercept. Missiles can be used to deliver conventional warheads at higher speed and more accurately than others. They could also be used to deliver nuclear warheads. And so the reason that Russia is using these, presumably, they say that it's because these are more efficient at destroying underground storage sites. But most people actually think this is just because Russia is attempting to dissuade the West from getting more broadly involved in Ukraine, reminding everybody, yeah, we also have hypersonic missile technology that can evade your air defense systems, and that could theoretically put a nuclear weapon down in a Western city. Meanwhile, Russia is upping the ante in Mariupol, which is located in the southern part of the country. According to the New York Times, firing rockets and bombs from land, sea, air, and probably for the first time from warships in the Sea of Azov, Russian forces broadened their bombardment of the besieged Ukrainian city of Mariupol on Sunday and have forcibly deported thousands of residents, according to city officials and witnesses. Among the freshly devastated was an art school where about 400 residents were hiding, according to city officials who claimed it had been bombed by Russian forces targeting civilians. The number of casualties was not known. Apparently, they had actually written on the ground, the Ukrainians, the word children in Russian right outside of this particular art school, and the Russians had bombed it anyway. Into the fourth week of the Russian assault on the country, the coastal city, a strategic port that would have given Russia control over much of Ukraine's southern coast, has increasingly become a grim symbol of Russian frustration that its superior manpower and weaponry have not forced the quick capitulation of the country. According to the New York Times, the city has been without food, water, electricity, or gas since February 24th. But its situation deteriorated even more over the weekend, with reports of raging street battles and Russian forces successfully conquering 3 neighborhoods. And on Sunday morning, the Azov Battalion, a Ukrainian regiment that has drawn far-right fighters from around the world and is charged with the city's defense, said 4 Russian naval vessels had shelled the city, largely cut off from the outside world. The toll on civilians there is difficult to assess. By the way, we'll get back to the Azov Battalion in just a second, because notice how the New York Times is soft-pedaling what the Azov Battalion is. The Azov Battalion is a neo-Nazi group. We'll get to that in just a little while, because this has been used by Putin as a pretext for invasion, saying that the Ukrainians are basically Nazis. And then everybody on the right side of the aisle in the West, everybody in the West has been saying Zelensky is Jewish, and that means that there's not a Nazi issue in Ukraine. Zelensky's resistance to the Russians can be heroic, number one. The Russian predations in Ukraine can be despicable, number two. And also Ukraine can have a Nazi problem, which they do. We'll get to that in just one moment. Last week, a Mariupol theater sheltering hundreds of people was reduced to rubble. The word children was written in huge letters on the pavement there, clearly visible from the air. Even now, the fates of most of those people remain unknown. So that is the current status of the war in Ukraine. Russia's assault has uprooted about 10 million people so far. American Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin says Russia is targeting population centers in order to inflict damage. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, said, quote, the war in Ukraine is so devastating, 10 million have fled, either displaced inside the country or as refugees abroad, which means almost a quarter of the country's pre-war population has now been uprooted. Roughly 3.4 million people have already left Ukraine since the Russian offensive began February 24th. Pretty much all of those are women and children bound for Poland. The UN says the number of refugees could reach 4 million people. Lloyd Austin said that Putin has not been able to achieve the goals he wants to achieve as rapidly as he wants to achieve them. It's had the effect of him moving his forces into a wood chipper. Russia's defense ministry on Sunday gave defenders of Mariupol until Monday morning to surrender. They said, we call on all units of Ukraine's armed forces, the battalions of its territorial defense, and foreign mercenaries to cease their military activities and lay down their weapons. And he basically threatened to raise the city. This is Mikhail Mizintsev, the head of Defense Ministry's National Defense Control Center, according to Interfax. He said, otherwise, the military tribunal that awaits you is only a small part of what you deserve. The streets of Kyiv, according to the Wall Street Journal, are mostly deserted at this point. Some city officials suspect more than half of its inhabitants have left, though the exact numbers are not yet known. And the Russian Defense Ministry showed no signs of letting up, even as its own military has taken big losses at this point. On Sunday, the governor of the Crimean city of Sevastopol reported the deputy head of Russia's Black Sea Fleet was killed in the attack on Mariupol, which is, I believe, the fifth or sixth Russian general to die in this attack so far, which is just an insane thing. I mean, the Russian incompetence here is a huge part of the story. And it demonstrates once again, dictators can generally not trust their own people. Because as it turns out, if you spend all of your time threatening people, everybody just lies to you. And there are all these jokes about the Soviet era where we pretend to plant the potatoes and you pretend to buy the potatoes. Right? That is the sort of old Soviet joke, is that when people are threatening to kill you, you will tell them whatever you want to tell them in order to prevent being killed. Now, it turns out all of his generals were telling Putin, everything is going to be fine. Everything is swimmingly. Everything's going swimmingly. Everything's great. Okay, so all of this is prelude to what comes next. And what I mean by that is that now that Russia is stalling out, the question becomes, can Putin afford to not use something like a weapon of mass destruction? Can Putin afford not to completely level cities? Because the alternative, apparently, is just him losing. And if the alternative is him losing, he's boxed in. We've been talking about this for a week. And there's this sort of odd level of triumphalism that has arisen in the West, that when you box in a dictator like Putin, who has demonstrated repeatedly his willingness to level civilian centers, ranging from Grozny in Chechnya to Aleppo in Syria, when you're dealing with that sort of dictator, the triumphalism that basically says, don't worry, Putin is going to lose and it'll all be fine. I'm just wondering where that triumphalism is coming from, particularly because, again, the one thing that Putin knows is that NATO and the United States are not going to get directly involved in this war in Ukraine. So Chuck Todd spent the weekend asking NATO's chief, Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General, how long can you stand by and watch? And the answer is that they can stand by and watch a rather long time, and they're going to stand by and watch for a rather long time, because if they set up a no-fly zone, they're afraid of being in a direct nuclear exchange with Vladimir Putin.
How long can NATO stand by and watch Russia target civilians without finding a way to help more when it comes to the Ukrainian resistance?
Okay, and Stoltenberg basically answered, I don't know what you want from us. Like, you're asking us to do a thing that is not really possible for us to do. It's easy for members of the media to be like, how can we let this happen? But the answer is, once deterrence failed, there were not a lot of choices that were available. Stoltenberg said NATO allies are stepping up their support to Ukraine, partly by delivering military support, human battalion support, and billions upon billions of financial support to Ukraine. And then, of course, we also imposed those unprecedented sanctions. He also said NATO allies have trained and supported Ukrainian armed forces for years. But is NATO willing to go to direct war with Russia? Not particularly. And so what this has led to is this strange insistence by a lot of people that Putin is on the verge of falling. Now, maybe he is and maybe he isn't, but I have yet to see the evidence that his generals are on the verge of overthrowing Vladimir Putin. And where is the actual evidence of this? So members of the West seem to have this sort of bizarre notion that there's going to be a revolution inside Russia that overthrows Putin. When has this happened? Like, really, well, what is the history of this sort of thing happening in the modern era where a dictator with modern weaponry and the ability to corral all of his oligarchs by basically holding up all of their money, where is the history of a revolution that has been successful against, let's say in the last 20 years, against a hardcore dictatorial leader? It hasn't happened in North Korea. It hasn't happened in China. It has not happened in Iran. It's not happening here. And that my prediction is no, Putin is not going to end up at the end of a rope thanks to the people who are surrounding him. But according to the UK Mirror, there is this, again, sort of wishful thinking that is set in. According to the UK Mirror, Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine because he is terrified of a pro-democracy revolution in Moscow, Boris Johnson has said. The prime minister said Putin was in a total panic about the prospect of a popular uprising in his own country if freedom was allowed to flourish in Kyiv. The Tory leader claimed the war was a turning point for the world, forcing countries to stand up to Russia rather than making accommodations with tyranny. Failure to support Ukraine now would result in a new age of intimidation across Eastern Europe from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Johnson said Putin's actions were not the result of concern about NATO or the prospect of Western missiles being based there. He dismissed Putin's crazy essay about the historical unity of the people of the two countries as semi-mystical guff. He said, I think he was frightened of Ukraine for an entirely different reason. He said he was frightened of Ukraine because in Ukraine they have a free press and in Ukraine they have free elections. Well, as we will get to in just a moment, that is sort of true and it is sort of not true. I mean, it is a fact that Ukraine is a developing democracy. It is certainly better than Russia. It is also the fact that they have some pretty significant internal corruption problems inside Ukraine, and they have for a very long time. Again, none of this justifies Putin's actions in Ukraine. What is to say is that I really doubt that this was motivated particularly by the fact that Ukraine had something approaching free elections. I don't think that's what drove this. I think what drove this is that Putin realizes that he's in the last days because he's 70 years old and may not be in great health. And he realizes that his legacy, like all Russian great leaders' legacy, is reliant on expanding his borders, whether you are Stalin or whether you're Peter the Great or whether you are Catherine the Great. It is the expansion of Russian borders that has made you a historic figure in Russian circles. Putin is certainly not going to go down in history as the man who revitalized the Russian economy, which is moribund and has been moribund for the last 20 years. But there's something dangerous about this idea that if you just keep pressing Putin and you push him and you push him and you push him, there's not going to be any sort of real backlash from a person who's, again, shown himself willing to kill hundreds of thousands of civilians in places ranging from Syria to Chechnya.